welcome to Pursuing Justice on Society Bites Radio. I hope everyone is following the social distancing regulations, as right now, that is the best we can do to keep ourselves safe. Our theme for the next 8 podcasts is the impact of having a parent or a sibling in prison, whether that loved one is guilty or innocent. In a very real sense, the family does the time with the person inside. I've invited a friend to open up this discussion. Her name is Amy Friedman. We have never met in person, but I feel a bond with her because she knows the workings of a prison as both a reporter and then as the wife of an offender. I taught for 4 years in a maximum security prison for 2,300 men, and for the last 8 years, I have visited several of those men in prison. So we have something in common. Back in 2009, Amy wrote an essay for the New York Times in a section that comes out every Sunday called Styles. Her piece was part of the weekly column called Modern Love. I loved her story so much that I found a way to email her, and we've been friends ever since. Welcome to the podcast, Amy.
Thank you, Harriet. And it is impossible for me to believe we haven't met in person.
Right. Well, one day. How about we begin with the story behind your essay that was called Kept Together by the Bars Between Us?
Sure. So to connect those two dots of my having been a newspaper reporter, was actually a columnist, and then married to a man in prison, was that in 1992, I was a newspaper columnist, and I lived in a city that was filled with, within 100 miles, there were about 40 prisons. And I realized I didn't know anything about prison, really, other than, kind of popular TV, some reporting. And so I got myself invited to go in to write a series of articles. My idea was to interview all people who were involved in prison. So to interview guards, to interview inmates, to interview family members, to interview psychologists, teachers, and so on, and to write kind of profiles. So to paint a picture of the universe that is prison. And there's a long story to this, and we don't have time, but I wound up falling in love with a man who was in prison. We ended up getting married, and he had 2 children who ended up becoming my stepdaughters, but I don't even call them stepdaughters, who became my daughters. And I learned in a really intimate way how prison impacts the families of prisoners. We were married for 7.5 years, 6 of which, little more than 6, he was inside, and he was paroled and came home. And our marriage ended about 18 months later. The girls, importantly, I never divorced them. I did divorce him. That article came from my effort over the years following our divorce to, my whole life I had been a writer, and I kind of unpack things by writing, find ways to understand my own story and to understand the world a little better. And so I began writing about the marriage, and started with that piece focused on what happened when he came home for him. The piece is about the way he began building walls around our home, literal walls. Mm-hmm. And that ended up growing into a memoir, which was published a couple years later. But that story that connected you and me just grew out of my trying to understand what happened when he came home, what happened, why the marriage dissolved, what had generated the marriage to begin with, and to understand myself a little better.
Are you willing to read a little section of that essay for us?
Oh, of the essay, yes.
Or would you prefer to read from your memoir? Either.
You know, I'm so sorry. I was thinking about the memoir, but I'm happy to read from the essay.
Okay.
I'm just going to get it up in front of me for a second.
Sure.
Yeah, I think it's, I think I might skip around a little bit, but I'll read the opening and then move to the part that I think is the gist of it. Okay. It starts with, when we met, he had already served 7 years of a 13 years to life sentence for murder. He was once a drug dealer and had shot and killed another dealer on a miserable spring morning in a little northern Ontario town. I was working as a newspaper columnist and had become intrigued by the prisons in Ontario and upstate New York. He was the chairman of the inmate committee at the first prison I visited, and initially he was hostile of me, wary of my intentions. The fact that we ultimately fell in love always arouses gasps of disbelief, but there wasn't much to it. We fell in love the way people do, the same way I had fallen in love with other men. So that's where it opens. And I'm going to skip down to, so this is me trying to kind of understand myself. Okay, so maybe I just liked bringing warmth into a lonely man's life. Maybe the marriage was pure ego, but then I always thought every marriage is in some ways. And yes, he had his lines that casually tossed off, I want my daughters to meet you. They need to meet an impressive woman. Those are the kind of lines that work on women like me who like to think we are professional and cannot be conned. And still some people said, oh, Amy, you fell for a con. Why do you think they call them cons? And God, could you ever, But they never asked me outright, did you ever make love? Yes, we did, every 3 months in a trailer on the prison grounds, behind walls and gates and under lock and key. And later I found out that guards could listen if they wanted to, because once one did, and he let me know that when I was leaving after one more goodbye. But I had never talked with anyone the way I talked with him. I had never had that kind of time. Nobody does. We talked for hours a day, often 7 days a week for nearly 7 years, sharing water or coffee, our feet sticking to the linoleum floors, backsides aching from hard chairs, eyes stinging from smoke, hands sweaty from clutching each other across the table, hearts fluttering, limbs aching to touch, and listening to the loudspeaker. Friedman, come to the desk. And then I think, I'm going to skip down again. I spent 6 New Year's days in prison visiting him, and this was year 7. I believed it would be the last, as his day parole hearing was in 2 months. Instead, I woke that morning on a cold, bitter day, knowing that something was wrong. The prison was several miles from the bungalow I bought 1 month before we married. I bought it because I wanted us to have a place of our own, a haven for him to come to one day, and a place of comfort for the girls and me. It was lopsided and badly insulated with yellow siding and a rickety roof, and it sat on the lip of the St. Lawrence River, and from every window I could see the water and towering pines and open land. On this spot on my sofa every night for all those 6 years, I'd sat and waited for his calls. I couldn't phone him. Prisoners have to call out, collect. And naturally, my phone bills were endless pages of collect calls. But I could never get enough of his voice, not even on those days when it was drenched with anger or suppressed fear. Everything about him turned my heart inside out. And even now, 10 years since I last saw him, I can hear the thick sadness in his throat and feel something that is no longer love, but remains a kind of sweet sadness for all that was lost. I think I'm going to I'm going to stop there unless you'd
Sure,
like me to
that's
read
fine.
more.
No, that sounds. I wanted just a flavor. Modern Love. It's interesting. People didn't really know much about it, and now, is it on
It's
Amazon
hot.
Prime? Yeah, it
Yes,
popped. It did.
yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
tell us what they did with Modern Love.
Well, they made it into first a podcast, and actually
Right.
the piece that I did was read by the incomparably wonderful actress Cherry Jones. So it has been translated to podcast. And she's a far better reader than I am. And now they've made it into a television show. So there are hundreds and hundreds of them because it's been running for, I want to say, probably 12, 13 years. So mine's not yet a television show, but we'll see. You never know.
That's great. Yeah, and they're all so different. So everyone has their own theme. Well, thanks for reading that. We know there's a good deal of research about the impact of having a mom, a dad, a brother, a sister behind a husband. Uh, Behind bars. And we know that there are nearly 3 million children dealing with this issue in their lives. I'd like you to tell us what you know on a personal level, and then tell us what you decided to do about this challenge in the lives of so many children.
Yeah. So what I know began with, of course, my kids. And myself to some degree, but I have to say that it was harder because I had spent so many years as a writer and as a speaker and kind of out there believing in the importance of telling one's own truth. I do teach still and taught for many years memoir, and what I know about the healing power of telling your own story and speaking your truth is pretty deep. So what happened to me when one day I was a newspaper columnist visiting prison and treated with all the respect in the world and invited to come in and bring all my bags and paperwork and so on with me. And the next day, after we got married, suddenly I was perceived in this entirely different way. I was suddenly someone who was to be looked at with suspicion, to be strip searched, to be demeaned. And I could fight back about that. I spoke out about it. It wasn't that it didn't hurt. It wasn't that it wasn't painful. It wasn't that there wasn't a great deal of loss that came in the wake of this. I was fired from my job. I was thrown off boards of directors. I lost friends. I lost family, all of whom came back, my family, by the way. But the girls, they had been very, very young. They had been 3 and 6 when their dad went to prison. And they had learned early on that there were people who were going to stigmatize them, and they had absorbed the shame of their father's deed. And they had learned never, ever, ever to talk about who their father was, where he was, or what they were experiencing. And one of the results of that, I mean, there are many results, and these are well documented in the research, but what I saw and felt and experienced with them was depression, fear, social isolation. You know, I mean, the story that really resonates with me is I remember when my older daughter had